The first step of making a cutting board is picking out a piece of maple with some interesting grain. And I've got a lot of boards to choose from. All of them are slabs that have come off various maple trees that have fallen out back over the last few years. I clamp a guide onto the chainsaw and I use an old ladder to get good flat board cuts. And then it's just good old-fashioned work slabbing that old tree trunk into a bunch of boards. I then measure and cut out a starter piece. And typically after I run the piece through the table saw, I also run it over the edger to get a perfectly flat and smooth surface that glues tightly together. Can't have any gaps in the glue joints of these cutting boards. For the first glue up, I'll typically add some extra pieces of maple that are maybe an inch wide and also some dark walnut strips for added accents early on. Then it's glue, clamp, and come back tomorrow. My favorite pieces in these cutting boards are the quilted maple. The blue arrows are pointing to the quilted maple pieces. The grain is just kind of wrinkled and contorted. It's super cool. It's an uncommon wood grain, and I sometimes find pieces of it in our firewood stack. And of course, when I find one, I pull it aside to mill into a usable board. To mill a piece of firewood into a usable board, I start with the edger and run it over and over until I get first one flat side. Then I put that edge up against the back and get a second squared flat side. At that point, I can use the bandsaw to cut away some of the unusable pieces of the wood. Then I use the planer and the table saw to finally end up with a quilted maple stick that I can glue into a cutting board. The next step is I take the cutting board that I glued up yesterday and start making some diagonal cuts. And those cuts have to be perfectly straight or they won't glue together well. So I just use a jig that I made for the table saw. After that, I run all the cuts across the edger. Then, where I made the diagonal cuts, I put in boards with some kind of contrasting texture that are 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 1 inch thick, whatever, and then glue and clamp. But this glue up is a little bit more complicated because the boards will slide as you put pressure on the clamps. They slide along the angular cuts, which are not perpendicular to the clamps. So to keep them from sliding sideways, I put a couple of cross clamps. After every glue up, I have to run it through the planer to get the board perfectly flat. And if I don't do that, the next glue up won't work well because the board will be torqued or a little bit offset. And this, of course, reduces the total thickness each time. So if I want to end up with a board that's, say, 5/8 inch thick, I need to start with 1 1/4, maybe even 1 1/2 inch thick. Because I'll probably cut and glue and cut and re-glue 7 or 8 times in the process of making one board. After making several diagonal cuts and re-gluing with more boards, it's time to put in the wavy strips. And usually those are walnut, but sometimes they're also maple. I've got a little jig for cutting the strips on the table saw, usually an 1/8 inch thick. Then I have to run both sides over the edger, and I'll use a bigger block of wood to hold them down so I don't shear off the tips of my fingers. Okay, then I just freehand the wavy cut on the bandsaw. And I'll usually warm up with the pieces of scrap wood to make this cut. Because any hesitation or break in the flow of making the cut creates a kink that just won't glue together well. It'll be a gap in the board. And I very lightly sand out the teeth marks from the bandsaw. And if I overdo that at all, again, it creates a gap in an area where I just sanded a little bit too deep. So this is a careful, kind of nerve-wracking part of the whole thing. Okay, and now it's time for the epoxy strip. I put in a little dye, and then I have to put it in the vacuum chamber because there's lots of micro bubbles that just won't come out of the epoxy, and then the center part gets really cloudy. So the vacuum chamber removes all that. I tape the bottom and sides and pour in the epoxy. The heat gun gets rid of bubbles that come up to the top of the epoxy before it dries. One last trip through the planer. One last cut on the edges to square them up, and then round off the edges on the router table. And then it's time to sand, and this kind of work is brainless enough that I usually have an audio book going, so I don't really mind it. The grit sequence I go through for all of the edges and the faces is 80, 120, 180, 220, 320, and 400 grit. And last, I oil them down with food-safe cutting board oil. And I usually use some stuff that's called milk paint. which is tung oil with some citrus juice mixed in to thin it.